Without any further ado, I'd like to call the Prime Minister to assume the floor and introduce the motion which stands in the name.
Madam Chair, I'm going to do three things for you in my speech. First of all, I'm going to outline the problem that we see in organized religions, not religions in themselves, so people believing in a certain God, but the way that we know religion and have known it for a very, very long time, namely it being in our societies through organizations like the church, for instance. Second of all, and then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the benefits coming from that. First of all, I'm going to talk about the benefits for individuals that are still religious and can still practice that and still have all the benefits of religion. And we think those are even going to be enhanced when if we would take away the organized part of that. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why we think the world beyond religious individuals would be a better one, or would have been a better one, if we didn't have organized religion. A little bit of clarification. Of course, we're not abolishing anything of that. It's a principal debate. We ask ourselves, what characteristics do organized religions have in them? And if we would take those away, would the world be actually a better place? And we say definitely yes. And this is what we're going to argue for you today. So let's clarify, first of all, a couple of things. So we don't think that religion in and of itself is something that is bad, that makes people badly, or we don't want to advertise or advocate against religion in and of itself. What we would like to argue against is organized religion. And first of all, I'm going to outline to you how we understand that and what that actually means for us. So when we look at religions and people being religious, the organized part of that comes with structures and with institutions, like, for instance, the church, like, for instance, certain hierarchies, certain people that have rights and have certain positions in a religion. The mufti, the priest, the pastor, so on and so forth, that have certain rights over their congregate, over their, like the community that they, parship or whatever it's called, that have certain duties and that have certain rights where they can define what religion is, that they actually rally the community around them, and they are the ones that, create a community through having a church, through having certain hierarchies, through having certain people that have special positions, that are the ones that actually can tell you how to interpret your religion, how the book that you read every day, that you can basically read on your own. We're very Protestant in that way. We think everyone can find God on their own. We don't need a pope and we don't need a priest. We can do it on our own, reading the holy book that is, part of our religion, whatever that is. And we think that is the problem with these structures. I'm going to outline what the specific problems with these structures is, but before that, please, go ahead.
So, just to be clear, if you're not okay with organized religion, how are you okay with texts that presumably come from organizations?
Yeah, the problem with organization, I'm going to talk about that. We think there's going to be, or there would be, a diversification, because of course we agree the texts that we have right now are a product of the organization. We think if we abolish those institutions, we would have a variety. For instance, like we would have texts, historical texts that were up for discussion if they should end up in the Bible as we read it right now, that might now, join the Bible. In the Bible, we would have different versions of the Bible, which is also true for the Quran and other books as well, if we would take away this institutional part that gets to decide what religion looks like. But this is also part of the problem. So what is the problem if you organize yourself as a religion? We think the problem that comes with organizing you and other people in a community as a religion is combined to having certain characteristics that mark you as a member of that community. We know this with religions, and especially with religions that's like split into different faiths, like for instance Protestant, Catholic, all those other things, evangelicals and so on and so forth that exist in the United States, that have specific characteristics that you have to do certain things, you have to believe in a certain way in what, when you take the wine and so on and so forth, what that does, how that works and so on and so forth, if that really turns into Jesus when you drink the wine, if that's really his blood, or if it's just symbolic. All those characteristics turn you into an organization that defines itself compared to the outside world, or to other organizations that also claim to have a right to define what the religion is. That means if you don't just practice on your own as a religious individual, but you're part of this institutionalized community that calls itself, evangelical, Protestant, Methodist, and so on and so forth, you create antagonism by defining other people that are outside you, that are doing what you're doing in the wrong way, or that are doing things that are harming you, or that are attacking you and your beliefs. Not right now, thank you very much. By constituting yourself as an entity and defining yourself in this entity against other people, you are also kind of putting in this idea that you have to kind of act. You have to act against other things. You have to convert them, for instance, to the truthfully faith, or you have to fight against them because you somehow feel threatened by them. For instance, politicians that are, I don't know, atheists that do certain policies that you don't like. This is the problem we see with the organized part of being religious, not just, reading your book, believing in certain things, acting according to that in your everyday life, but organizing yourself as a community, as a religious community, and these are the problems we think would not exist. I'll talk about that later, but before that, yes.
Do you name any belief system which does not in some way contrast itself with those who do not subscribe to that belief system?
The problem, and you really have to be careful here, the problem is not me sitting in my home every Sunday reading the Bible and then acting according to that, interpreting it as I think fit, as I, maybe you would think it would also be okay if I talk to my family. The threshold is crossed when it becomes organized, when it becomes an institution that has a certain purpose, that understands itself as an institution that has to act, that has to defend itself, that has certain interests that it is representing of its members against other religious groups that organize themselves in the very same way, or against non-religious organizations that it wants to attack or from which it wants to protect itself. Which leads me to my first point, why we believe all the positive things that we get out of religion as individuals are still possible. Because the one main thing that only religion can give us is this idea of morality, of purpose, of how do I live my life, what ethics do I apply, is there life beyond life, and so on and so forth. We still think everyone can do that by reading the holy texts that, tell stories, give you like guidance, how to act in certain ways, compassion, love your neighbor, and all those things that give you the possibility as an individual to think about ethics and morale and decide what you think is correct, how you should behave in society, and how you should lead your life. So we think all those positive benefits of peace and guidance for you as an individual that you get from believing in God and life after that are still there. You don't have to go to church every Sunday to do that. You don't have to do that to have all those positive benefits for yourself. And lastly, it is also better for a world where, we don't have antagonism between religions that think that they have to convert the other side. We have had wars for centuries just because people organize themselves to be a group to convert the rest of the world to believe in what they believe. And we also think it would be better for our politics if we had religious organizations staying out of all those worldly matters because they just don't exist to meddle in things that have nothing to do with what they actually are there for, namely providing guidance and moral ideas to the people that believe in them. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for her remarks and invite the Speaker from the Opposition to introduce the case for our bench.
Here on opening opposition, Julius and I clearly do not sanction all the practices of organized religion. We think parts like of priesthood, how exclusive it is problematic. What Julius and I stand for is not the complete destruction of organized religion, but of a form of organization or religion that's much more open, particularly Hart House. We think that organizing a religion is a necessity and much better for the world in terms of actually dealing with spirituality, and that's the case that Julius and I stand for really clearly. I have 3 points of constructive matter. First, I'm going to talk about the importance of standardization and organization to spirituality, of why we think it's necessarily important to actually creating all the benefits he talked about spirituality and making it organized. And second, I'm going to talk about how organization breeds internal criticism, which causes change. Therefore, we're going to talk about how we're actually the better side, that can actually enact change within organization and stop oppression that the government's bench is clearly against. And third, I'm talking about why the internal peace within religion is particularly emphasized when you have more organization, which is why they are okay with spirituality, but not okay with, which is problematic, considering they're okay with spirituality, but not organized religion. Rebuttal will be interwoven. So first and most importantly, they talk about how organization leads to problematic aspects that people have to be antithetical to each other. First and most importantly, on a very basic criticism, we think basically all ideas are kind of like that. Like if you choose to be Marxist, you're going to be against capitalism. We think most ideas are like an echo chamber where they use a particular case. But what's the important thing about religion? we think what happens is, because of religion, we don't think religion always will be ended in a fight with each other. Like the Protestants and Catholics haven't had a great war in over like 300 years yet. They're kind of okay with each other. There's not a great mandate to try to help each other, to like convert the other person and more there. But more importantly, we actually think standardization is important to spirituality, particularly because it breeds credence or strength within that own religious practice. What are we talking about? We're talking about how people see other individuals doing the same practices as them, like Pentecost, or going to church, or going to Eid for Muslims. What happens is this means a greater strength that their belief is right. It means to them understanding that what happens is a lot of individuals are doing this. It's in practice before. This theory of tradition and custom is really important to religions, and the organization within is the only manner to which you can get this possibly powerful practice inherent within that. What does this create? First and the most basic impact that we get is that it creates a stronger sense of belief of what happens in the spirituality of the world. What happens is religion doesn't just create morality, which is what the opening government tried to say, that religion, and people don't need religion to create morality. Religion answers questions that people don't know how to answer the questions to, like where do I go when I die? Or questions like what does particular action do in the afterlife, therefore. These questions are plaguing the human soul as we very speak. What happens is, when you have an organized religion that can provide those answers to you, that people themselves do not have the one-on-one capability of answering such a tough question, but realize that thousands and thousands of years of people have constantly answered this question this way and believe in it so, is much more appeasing to them and their certain beliefs, and that's really important that we think we lose on the side of how without spirituality. But second is another aspect. We think they're talking about communities as problematic. Religious communities, we think, have done much better in the world than they've actually done harm. Why do we think that? Because what happens is communities create a banner to be under. Julie's going to talk about how this creates better inter-religion dialogue between different types of religion. But on the inter-religion, like how religions interact, what happens is you have the same standardization occurs, you have the same events to attend, you have a common identity, which creates like a brotherhood. But the point is, the difference between religion and other identities like nationalism is that your brotherhood, your family, lasts for eternity. Like that's the kind of belief within that. Why is that good? It's because it means you share everything with these individuals. You talk to your pastor about your problems that are inherent that you never share to your neighbor. You talk to issues like my problem by marriage, or things that are really close to you because you trust these individuals as organized places. What happens is this allows individuals to talk about it more, for people to be in the problems together and share that common weight. That has a huge thing to it. If they don't believe this is powerful, then they need to go to African American communal places that have strong churches from the South, which what happens is their neighbors who's been their grandmother who taught them Bible is the same person who cooks for their children or watches for your children as you go to work. It creates a brotherhood that lasts beyond that. It creates people being tied together that are so strong with that particular relationship that those communities that don't have an identity outside of things of religion do have an identity that's powerful and meaningful in that particular aspect. Back half.
So there are some instances where people form intensely deep bonds with their religious communities, but isn't it true that they have bonds with their family members, with their close friends that rival those that they have with their pastor?
Okay, so what happens is some of the problems you might have might belong with your family. Like, I don't like this thing my brother's doing, or my husband is doing questionable things, or might be cheating on me. So what happens is they need an intermediary that's non-familial. But more importantly, what happens is it's more important for them to have a lot of different perspectives or an entire community that can help them out, that can donate huge amounts of money when you're down in your luck, when your family can't possibly do that. The communal effect, if you're okay with that, like aggregating to more people should be better on your side of the house. I don't think it's a good question. The secondary tier impact of our community is also the idea of imagined communities. The fact that when you say I'm Christian or I'm Muslim, you start imagining people who are outside your own intermediate community. Why is this good? Because what happens is it allows people to fight for oppression of minority rights within individuals who are outside your community, but you still identify as someone who's close to you. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for black African American rights all over because his church doctrine understood that they together are imagined communities. The Catholic Church, the #1 donor of charity, continually gives to other organizations and also to do good because the organized religion constantly encourages this. Organization leads to this institutional ability to create communities that are able to tackle bigger effects than just one person spiritually believing. This is the comparative advantage that we don't think the government can ever get to. Second point, the organization and how it actually leads to change. All types of ideology create oppression. There was an entire Cold War upon ideological doctrine. Religion is particularly pernicious, and they're going to talk about this because what happens is about the soul, so they're really fanatical about it. But the good thing about organized religion is that when you're talking about questions of the soul, and that religions unilaterally only right. You only get change when internal criticism exists. Look at the Mormon Church, which continuously in the 1970s denied people, black people were like scorched by earth, by God, and were like not good and not clean people. But it's only until internal leaders were like, no, this is not good, that they changed that religion, that bad practice. Pope Francis is also a great reformer that's constantly changing the church. Why do you not get that on their side of the house? Because in spirituality, people inherently believe their religion is always right. That's the purpose of religion. You're not supposed to question it, right? In spirituality, if people sort of touch their own religion for part of their strong doctrine start to question it, that's only when you actually start questioning yourself. Internal changes within there don't exist there. This is a comparative advantage that we're really important to talk about. And third, lastly, Julius will hammer more about internal parts of religion and why that feeling is empowered. But for these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and invite the deputy to assume the floor and resume the defense of Standford in this case.
Still in my lifetime, the IRA was committing strong attacks on other people who were, by the way, from the same religion, broadly speaking, but still they were fighting each other. Still in my lifetime, there was the attack of 9/11. And when we look at Palestine, I'm pretty sure this year we had a couple of terrorist attacks there. So just claiming that this was a problem of 300 years ago doesn't make it true, just to state that. So this problem is still existing. I will tell you why it is existing and how it wouldn't exist if we had other structures. What's so problematic about structures that are religious? Some of that was already in his speech. So firstly, I will talk about in my speech about institutions and about institutional economics and why institutions tend to grow and why this is extremely pernicious in the idea of religion. After that, I will talk about the interference of religions in personal lives and why this is problematic to make people happy, which should be our overall aim. So, they were basically telling us stability. It's necessary to have stability to answer questions. Two answers to that. Firstly, there is still the book, and in all those books there are answers that you can find yourself if you start to read it. So this is one possibility. Other options are you just ask the question yourself and might come to another answer. I'm not religious at all, I came to an answer and I have stability in myself. This doesn't necessarily mean that I have an unhappier life. For you it means that you have an unhappier life because you grew up knowing all this. If those religions wouldn't have existed in the first place, you wouldn't have this problem with the stability in the first place as well. So we don't think that you will then have the problem. And if you have this problem, you still have your individual answer in the books that are there. We just believe that it's not good if people are telling you what this book actually says, because often people don't tell what it's actually said in the book, or otherwise. The next idea is that that you believe that you don't get enough charity. We say, why? I don't see any reason. We just see that this charity might have other causes as well. I personally, as I said, I'm not religious. I think lots of other people are not religious. And there is no problem in giving it to other NGOs than the Caritas. If you want to help other people, there is still empathy there. And empathy helps you even if you are not religious. And this is true for lots of people. We don't think just because right now the Catholic Church is the largest donator doesn't mean it must be in the future. This is technical, it is odd fallacy. And I will tell you later why it's problematic. Now to my constructive material. Firstly, institutional economics. So, institutions tend to grow. Firstly, because people see when they are institutions, they tend to seem that they think that they are more important than they actually are objectively. Because you are doing it, what you are doing, you always think is more important than what other people are doing because you are investing so much time and personal effort in this. Secondly, you are aiming for power extension. The idea that if I have more people in my organization, then I feel happier about it, then I have a higher social status, and this is what makes me happy. Why is this is happening in nearly all organizations? Why is this extremely problematic in religious institutions? Because you can always say, God said so. This is the institution that was given by God. This is the justification for it. You cannot argue with it, otherwise you will go eternally to hell, which is usually a thing that is not desirable for believers. So the idea there is that you must not question this, otherwise if you are questioning the institution, namely the Catholic Church or the institutions built in the Islam community, the same thing happening in in Jewish communities as well. It is the detrimental part. You must not question it. So they are right. You cannot question it, you cannot make it smaller. So you as well said how important actually this is. Why is this problematic? Because firstly, you must rise in those communities. How do you do it? You comply to the rules that they are. You comply to the rules, and those rules are technically always incentivized to have incentivized inertia, which means that minority rights, for example, are not interesting for those institutions because the majority rules there, and you have the scripture which is there. Secondly, you have the problem that you cannot overcome actually acute problems that just arose shortly, namely AIDS. So this is a problem that arose, that it hasn't been there 2,000 years ago, but the idea is that you can actually solve it. And people who have never come into contact with it will give the same answer they have always been given. They have not the possibility in a faster, ever-changing world to adapt to changing circumstances. I will tell you after that why this is incredibly problematic before that.
In the Bible, it clearly says word for word that you should stone adulteresses and you should condemn gay individuals. It is only because internal church leaders have started to reinterpret the doctrine.
Please sit down. The idea is there that people might see this Bible and then think, that's incredibly stupid. They will see it and say, if all this were true, then probably I shouldn't do it. And this is what we have in a Western liberal society that we are still thinking we are in. It will seem a little absurd to take all this, which it is. So the idea is that then you start to think, well, which are the sensible parts to take out of it? How can I find God myself in this framework I'm in? Because we believe most of the people will then grow up with the values we are teaching them, which are Western liberal values as a basis, and spirituality coming from the book, the idea that you then take the ideas that are smart out of the book. And not just the idea that, for example, homosexuality is a sin, which is the idea of interfering in my personal life. The main problem is we have now these rules. These rules are inherently conservative. And these inherently conservative rules have the problem that they make me unhappy. They inherently make me unhappy when it comes to problems in myself, in my personal existence. Might it be homosexuality, might it be sexual desire before marriage, or even an extended sexual desire, not just to one person or to several persons. Might it be the idea that STDs still kill in Africa? Might it be the idea that you should kill yourself to get virgins, because entities say so? This is a thing you cannot question, because if you question it, you go to hell. This is basically the idea. If you are using a condom, this is still a doctrine of the Catholic Church. If, no matter what he's telling you, when you're using a condom, this is a sin. The problem there is we believe this is not cannot actually work with the problems we have today. What does it lead to? It leads to patriarchy. It leads to all those problems that a church of old people cannot deal with. But by the way, all old white men who are all old men who are actually choosing what is good for you. So the basic idea there is, I have problems in my life. This problem is solved by an hierarchical institution that just grows if it complies more and more to its own rules, which has no insight in my personal beliefs. So that these rules that are in those organizations will and must clash with my personal preferences. This clash of preferences will be strong in very often cases, and especially in minority cases. It will be strong, and it will be so strong that it makes me unhappy. We see this with homosexuals in the Catholic Church. We believe that this is problematic. The other idea is that you're saying the church is important because I grew up with it and I know it. But we have to imagine a world where it never existed in the first place, where never people grew up with it. They will imagine an alternative structure. They will find friends. They will work with debating societies. They will working in the soup kitchen. All those things are alternatives for them. And those alternatives will give them the same stability as the stability you might have had beforehand. We don't see why spirituality and organization must be attached to this stability, therefore govern.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and invite the second speaker from side opposition to conclude the first half of this round of debate. Here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Side opposition in this debate stands for organized religion as a means of giving people meaning to their lives, as a means of uniting them with a larger community and giving them a purpose for their existence here on earth, which can be tremendously valuable when they believe that it is supported by a long and constant tradition. I'll have three additional points for you today, Madam Speaker. First, how this policy helps hold communities together. Second, how it promotes dialogue between groups and within groups. And third, how it helps fight the very oppression which the prior speaker says that religion actually fosters. But first, a few points of rebuttal. He starts his speech in an incredibly unfair way by saying, oh look, religions at the extremes are very violent. Thanks. Areligious organizations at the extremes are also very violent. Stalin, who famously asked about the Pope how many divisions does he have, was a mass murderer. Mao, who killed over 50 million Chinese who also strongly rejected religion, was also a mass murderer. And so, Madam Speaker, you can't simply decide this debate on the basis of whether or not religious people sometimes take that belief to an extreme, because we know that irreligious people are just as capable of doing the exact same thing. Second point they make, Madam Speaker, is that, look, there are no benefits that flow from things like charity on our side of the House, because people will give to charity anyway. To an extent, that's true. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, is that you get additional charity because people give because the church told them to engage in tithing, or because they think that they'll get salvation as a result. Now, those may be selfish motives, Madam Speaker, but the fact of the matter is they'll be taking more money out of their own pocket in order to help those who really need it because they believe in the organizational structure which tells them to do so. We think that helps the most downtrodden in society all over the world who are the beneficiaries of that charitable giving. The third point they make, Madam Speaker, is we think a very unfavorable characteristic and untrue statement about religion, which is that religion never encourages any form of self-criticism or self-doubt. I think the Parliament Speaker should open a Talmudic text, Madam Speaker. It's all full of rabbinical leaders debating one another, debating what are very often fundamental aspects of the religion to see whether or not a particular practice comports with Judaism. And the same is true in Islam and Christianity, where these particular ideas are all up for debate, and through that debate, religion actually is able to strengthen itself and to purify itself with more extreme elements, which I'll get to a bit later. And the final point, Madam Speaker, that he makes is that, well, we want people to be able to interpret religion themselves. Under the status quo, they can do that, Madam Speaker. That is not what this debate is about. This debate is about whether or not the world as a whole would be better off if everybody was left to find religious meaning in religious texts on their own, rather than a larger portion of those individuals being able, if they find satisfaction in it, to go through an organized hierarchy which is supported by thousands of years of tradition, and which gives them a sense in what they believe in is right, not just something that they came into one morning. First point, Madam Speaker, how this helps hold communities together. When the fact of the matter is that people in our society often define their communities on the basis of religion. For example, you have things like Jewish communities and Islamic communities. Very often, those communities are formed as a response to a majority society, which does not always want to make sure that their needs are satisfied. And so, Madam Speaker, they create these tight-knit organizations as a means of supporting each other around a religious institution. Those groups, Madam Speaker, support one another in ways that go beyond the mere teaching of particular gospel. They do things like set up charity organizations. They do things like set up schools which are low cost and offer tuition assistance for those who cannot pay. They do things like also offer places of worship where people can go and again find spiritual meaning in their lives. What does this give to people, Madam Speaker? We think from the more practical perspective, it gives people a sense of support. That when you're down, Madam Speaker, you can go to an organizational hierarchy which can say you have an obligation to support your fellow Muslim because it is supported by religious texts which your heritage says you must believe in and which has been believed in hundreds of years. I'll take you 1 second. But also that it gives people a sense of identity and meaning, a sense that I'm not just American or Canadian or British, but I'm also a member of the supported religious community, and that together we had engaged in a common endeavor to try and succeed in our society. Yes?
In the past 100 years, the importance of being religious and being organized as a religious person has gone down for all of us. We still have all those benefits that you talk about, like charity, rallying around a community, maybe because you're a vegetarian today, or because you have a certain sexual preference. Things change and we still have benefits. Please, can you weigh up with all the negative things we talked about?
We're very happy.
And organized religion?
We're very happy in some of the ways that religion has changed. For example, religion has gotten much softer on things like having women in the clergy. We have now egalitarian Judaism, for example, liberal Judaism, which has emerged in the past century, which say it's okay to have women in the clergy. And so even if you have seen a marginal decline in organized religion, we don't think that supports the case at all. That would be better off if it did not exist entirely. And so, Madam Speaker, we think that holding communities together is a reason why you ought to support organized religion as a means of providing people a support system and a sense of identity. But second, how does this promote dialogue between groups and also within groups? We think there will be antagonisms in either world, Madam Speaker. Why? Because people will default to other notions of collective identity associated with either politics or the individual religious beliefs, which they'll come to in the absence of any sort of organization. So what is the difference? The difference is that when you have an organizational structure, you can have conversations with others. For example, the Mormon Church being able to have conversations with other churches, which led them to conclude that, in fact, blacks are not actually inferior, and then they used their hierarchical structure to be able to tell all Mormons that they must believe the exact same thing, thus actually pushing progress in a way that would have been impossible if each individual Mormon did not answer to that same hierarchical structure. But also, there's benefits between groups, within groups, Madam Speaker, because, for example, when rabbis clarify religious position or imams try and clarify what exactly Islam stands for. You have a circumstance where religion is able to progress, in which religion is able to stay more in touch of the views of the particular membership. And so, Madam Speaker, in our present world, we've had a circumstance in which the more radical elements of Islam have been actually pushed to the margins, have been told very strongly by the vast majority of Muslims that they do not stand for what Islam is truly about. That is an enormous benefit, Madam Speaker, in making sure that the most extreme elements do not get to say that I stand for the power of Islam, because there's an organizational structure which says, hey, you don't, and which makes sure that ordinary Muslims do not subscribe to those beliefs, regardless of what one person might conclude when the Quran talks about jihad. And finally, Madam Speaker, what about the interest in fighting oppression? It is simply not true that these groups are inherently conservative and never support social change. From slavery, abolition of slavery, to the civil rights movement, to the gay rights movement, religious people have always played a key role in ending the oppression associated with this, through things like organization, through having meetings in the black church to get people to go to rallies, but also, Madam Speaker, through fighting with other people who also share the same belief about the proper interpretation of Christianity. Because we acknowledge that people claim, on the basis of religion, to engage in oppression, but those people have been successfully fought off by others within that very same religious group to actually be able to push the entire structure and the entire religious organization forward. And that does not just benefit those in that particular religion, but the entire society as a whole, when those people proceed to donate, to march in favor of things like same-sex marriage, in favor of things like civil rights for a larger number of people. And so the organizational structure of Martin Luther King promoting the civil rights movement was absolutely key in making sure that that eventually happened. So at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, we ask that you vote in favor of communities which give people a sense of identity and a support network, and vote in favor of organized religion in which dialogue can occur both within groups and between groups to ultimately strengthen religion and society as a whole. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Speaker for his remarks and invite the Member of Government to assume the floor and introduce the second matter this round. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, I want to talk about hipsters. I want to talk about hippies. I want to talk about people who own yachts. I want to talk about wealthy people and poor people, people of different nationalities, people of different races, people of different football teams who form groups all the time and collaborate with each other through society, share preferences, right? Hipsters around the world have got beards, they drink PBR. Religious people read the same textbooks. What happens that makes an organization of these groups very different? What happens that turns a fraternity organization from something that we consider banning from our campuses, you know, out of what was just like bros hanging out, having a good time? Right? Those characteristics of an organization, right, aren't the kinds of things like I guess you guys thought you wanted to talk about in terms of like, do they have the same book? Like, we all have the same beard, we all wear the same floral shirts, we drink the same PBR. The difference is in what we can do with the power of our organization, which was a good and subtle model that opening government brought up today. Organizations can fundraise. They can gather together massive amounts of wealth and point them in the direction of things, goals that they want to achieve. Organizations can collectivize. They can gather their power, bring it up, and whip it into shape to make it have the beliefs and ideologies that they want it to have, and the power structures at the top are capable of changing that. And organizations have voice. They have a political voice that can change laws and do things like make it illegal to be gay within countries. We think that these are all abhorrent things. We want to get rid of them, and we want to keep all the warm and fuzzy stuff that you guys are bringing us on that side of the house. The first thing I want to do today is go into a little bit more detail about how, when organizations fight for membership, fight for inclusion, they start to do really perverse things, and unpack for you how that happens. Because we don't think it's just about, you know, saying that, like, oh, God is on our side, so you've got to believe it, right? People have to believe in that God in the first place. They have to have those like years of tradition in the first place. How did that occur, Madam Speaker? It occurred because churches and organizations recognize, and so, brief aside. There's capital C church, the big organization that exists. There's like the local thing on the corner. And the mega church was like maybe somewhere in between. We're talking about something in between there. We're not quite sure where, but it's clear that this stuff is bad. It's bad because these kinds of churches recognize that their power comes from their ability to gather people together. To gather, like, the more people that believe in what you're selling, the better, like, the more power and authority you have, the more money you have, the more political power you have, so on and so forth, right? So you naturally try for these things because you believe you're doing good with the group that you have, and you want to extend these kinds of benefits. But what do you do in that process that's so harmful? You galvanize your group against other groups. You highlight the particular differences so people understand that they must choose your group, and their donations must flow through you, and all the, like, the things that they identify as a person are radically different. If you look at religious philosophies among different groups, aren't actually that different. We've come to some common principles like respecting the people around us, generally not being a douche. I'm trivializing it, right? But that's because there are deep similarities here, very intuitive principles behind this. It's the small peccadillos of religious doctrine that get in the way and that are highlighted by the church and held up as the only examples of the things that these religions stand for, because that's what brings people over to your side. It makes it impossible for you to be a Sunni if your parents were Shia. Right? These are the kinds of things that preserve the power structures and the kinds of things that bring all the terrible harms, like the Crusades, like colonization for the goal of spreading your religion. Like, they also make it easier for other groups to target you. So Jews in the Holocaust, right, very much stand out as a group with particular policies that are capable of being identified, right? These kinds of things both make it easier for you to target others and for others to target you. Because your enemy is a massive, monolithic, religious entity that has the same attributes that you have. And you are a massive, monolithic, authoritarian structure, right? And these kinds of things cannot coexist peacefully in the same way that, like, hipsters and bros don't actually shoot each other all that often, because their beliefs aren't so radical, because the differences between them aren't made so stark by their leadership. We tell you that churches are capable of, okay, so in the process of this, right, churches force you to do all kinds of terrible things. Hold on just a second. They force you to do bad things like hazing in fraternities, right, because these bad things bring you together. When you're forced to exclude other groups, you more rigorously define your own identity. That's how we get these atrocities.
Are you saying there's no such thing as a society with a large number of religions which live in relative peace with one another?
Like, yes, but that's because they don't emphasize these differences to such a large degree. Right? Like, the degree to which they emphasize these differences is the degree to which we see conflict. We need to get rid of the part that emphasizes the differences, i.e. the organizations. Secondly, we want to talk to you about, I guess another point here is that religions like change the law to do these kinds of things, right? The anti-gay laws that I talked about earlier, actually bending the legal system to make it possible to differentiate. But the second thing I want to talk about today is how these organizations make it possible to stagnate bad ideas, to push science to the wayside. For example, right, like rejection of evidence-based beliefs, rejection of like the age of the universe, but more importantly, like the power of vaccinations, the existence of climate change, the kinds of things that are bad for societies to deny. We tell you we get these things on our side of the house, because when you don't have an entity that's like agreed that this is the doctrine, you have individual groups looking for the truth themselves. This neighborhood religion does its own thing, that neighborhood religion does its own thing. And what tends to prevail in those instances when you have massive, like lots of groups out there all collecting information, things, they tend to converge on things that are evidence-based, right? You know, the ones who believe, it's sort of an evolutionary process here, right? But the ones who believe in things like immunizations or whatever, there's a lot of evidence to support these kinds of things. And there isn't a central body of millions, actually billions of people around the world who believe the same thing that you do, that you can turn to and say, like, look, you got your evidence, right? We've got thousands of years of history on our side. We've got billions of people around the world who believe us.
The difference between answering questions like theory and fact versus religion is that religion tries to create narratives and stories that are inherently hard for individual people to accept without actually knowing, like, the bigger fact is the entire universe is behind you as well.
So I think that First and Drop actually dealt with that pretty well, right? People look for these answers in their own ways. But religion do like make it possible to have these outdated beliefs that are not evidence supported, and the organizational characteristic of religions is what makes that possible. It also makes it possible to do things like deny LGBT people rights, because everyone around you believes the same thing. We think in a fair world this doesn't happen. We think that people build communities, they build families, they build friendships with people much stronger than the ones that they have with the Pope. Even though, like, we read his magazine or whatever it is, right? Like, we still think that we identify with the people who are humanly close to us, right? And we form good communities with those people. We struggle against problems of existence. We struggle against, like, you know, what are good things to do. And largely communities around the world, even those that don't have a lot of religion in their government, have decided that there are certain principles, certain good beliefs that you can have about how you should treat other people. We seem to be finding those without religion just fine. Those are the kinds of things that can still exist. When you let human beings out on their own and you ask them to decide what's good for each other, they tend to agree on these kinds of things. That's not a unique benefit that religion gets for us. Instead, it makes it possible to put on blinders and to force ourselves to see only particular things, to make it very difficult to disagree. We get these benefits of good communities and so on and so forth, but we don't have it at the cost of forcing people in these bad ways and controlling our societies like we see today.
I'd like to thank the member for his remarks and invite the member of the opposition to the floor to extend the case for on the bench. Here.
Madam Speaker,
speaker, a lot of the harms that we hear specifically out of that extension speaker are not unique to organized religion, but the benefits that we show you on side opposition, and that I'll continue to show you on second op, are entirely unique to the sense of community. I think from both teams we've gotten a massive overestimation of an individual's ability to reconcile difficult questions on their own, to come up with the same types of things. The only response we hear is that you still have the books. I think that fundamentally ends up undermining a lot of their case and a lot of the ways that side second gov tried to sneak away from it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into our extension. I'm going to talk about how new ways in which this helps individuals. I'm going to talk about individuals in poor situations insofar as it gives them hope. I'm going to talk about reconciling death and guilt, and then I'm going to talk about why it's unique in terms of accessing morals and the ability to act. So first let's talk about how this helps individuals, because the greatest instance of deep religious faith often occurs in countries or in areas that are massively harmed economically or socially. So a lot of people who feel as though there is no way out of their current situation. I think that if you live there without something bigger than yourself, you likely feel that nothing is going to get better because it hasn't for a very long time. Rather, what I feel religion ends up doing for you is providing you with a sense of something bigger than yourself, that you are part of a whole, and that this does not mean that you are ultimately always going to have to be in that way. It gives you a sense of hope that even if you live like this, there is somebody looking out for you, that the meek shall inherit, that there's a reason why you are going through something troubling. I think that makes it a lot easier for you to reconcile this psychologically. I think that means that a lot of people living in what seems like hopeless situations end up being able to keep living and being happy with themselves and get something out of life, is because they feel that that's not all that is about them, that there is something that happens afterwards, and that they're going to be rewarded for what they've had to endure, and that somebody is ultimately looking out for those people. No thanks. I think that ultimately, if you don't have that, you end up feeling meaningless and isolated, because if they tell you that, individuals can somehow reconcile these big questions, it doesn't feel like that when you don't know if other people feel the same way as you. It just feels like you're alone, and if you can't give yourself an answer as to what happens after death, I doubt that you're going to feel particularly happy when, say, a loved one dies and you have no idea what happened, because they would not want you to share your beliefs with other people for the sake that it might become organized, or that you might want to create some kind of institution to protect yourself and those beliefs. No. So I actually don't think that you are able to get those same benefits, and that the individual is able to reconcile these questions. And the only way I think that they end up ever proving that they might be able to do that is if they followed the book that was the very foundation of the original organized religion, because they wanted to give you a book so that people would buy the same things and the same prescriptions for acting. So I actually don't think that they can get any of those benefits with keeping the books and sort of being Catholic or being Muslim, but not actually telling anybody about it, but still following those same kinds of things. So what does this actually end up doing? I think that this ends up alleviating the struggle that you go through with a lot of emotional times. So that's when a loved one dies, that's when you're facing death. I think that that means that you're not as psychologically harmed from that. But furthermore, I want to talk about guilt, because I would tell you a lot of times what religion provides is an ability for you to have a second chance, for you to feel that you are not defined by your greatest mistake. And I think that that's something that is crippling, that the kind of guilt that you end up feeling for making a big mistake changes your life if you feel that you cannot separate yourself from that. And at the point that religion tells you that the way that you do that is by changing your actions and by making up for it in the future, and that they give you that kind of reconciliation, I think that means that people are much more able to get past that and act in good ways, fundamentally, for individuals. I think that we alleviate a lot of that suffering that is caused and that ends up lasting for a very long time. Yeah.
So, what about Catholic guilt?
Okay, I mean, what I would tell you is that a lot of the types of things that we provide you are very unique benefits to the individual. I think that the kind of guilt that you get from making a mistake or doing something harmful to individuals is fundamentally more so than anything I think that you can ever feel apart from that. I think that the kinds of communities that end up coming together to support you in trying to change your life, or the ability that you feel you can change your life and that someone will recognize that change as being beneficial, is really good. I want to talk now about accessing morals, and specifically why this is important. So from our front half up, we hear that religious people give a lot of charity. I want to delve into specifically why, and why it's unique to organized religion. Because I would tell you that a lot of religions prescribe reasons and and reasons to behave. And I don't think that this is unique to perhaps a religious person. Usually it ends up confirming a lot of what human empathy would tell you to do. But why is it different? Because I think that human empathy is usually called upon because you see something or because you're actually in contact with a particular problem. But at the point at which you're not engaging with poor people living in Africa suffering of AIDS all the time, and that it doesn't come into your mind's eye as much. I feel that the prescription of religion that you should always be seeking out people to help is something that's usually helpful. I think that human empathy only goes so far, that the intellectual capacity for someone to care about somebody else comes into play. I think you get this uniquely, with religion, and that's specifically important. No. I'm going to deal with refutation of some broad themes we hear from front half before getting into the extension. So first of all, I just want to deal with this issue about antagonism and that going against people is fundamentally something religious. What I would tell you is that a lot of the times where we see religion not being able to peacefully coexist is not because they believe something different, but rather because it's about land or it's about economics, and they use religion as a justification. So I don't actually think that you get any kind of different social cohesion without organized religion. Rather, I think it just becomes about something else. But what we tell you is specifically that you only get those kinds of things, you only get those kinds of psychological benefits from religion. So on the comparative, that weighs out more. Then what they say is, look, you don't, then what they say is that it's God says so, so people are ending up going to act on that because, and that means that you're not going to change as much. Two responses. One, I think a lot of people probably hold these beliefs. What does it mean? How do you change the beliefs of people that we don't like? Probably not an outsider telling them that they're wrong. Rather, somebody on the inside who can also appeal to the belief that God is real and that God would rather you act in a specific way. I think that that ends up appealing to you more. Let's deal with the extension. What we get broadly out of them is that, look, the types of things that religions are able to do in terms of consolidating power and money means that they have a massive ability to influence a lot of change. I don't think that this is unique to specifically religion, but I think that a lot of that community ends up alleviating human suffering. I think that a lot of the types of things that they're able to do with money, that they're able to do with that kind of community, ends up being able to actually help a lot of people. So if we're looking at the fact that sometimes maybe they say there's a belief that we don't like, and we understand that the best way to change that belief is from somebody on the inside, I think that we've been out on that comparative too. But they say, look, they end up highlighting the intricacies of their specific differences in order to become unique. I think that they need to tell us specifically why this is not just a justification and that it is inherent to believing something religious. I don't buy that that's true. So because Binu and I tell you specifically why we actually think that people get more out of it, that accessing morals is easy, that all these benefits are unique to organized religion, while the harms are not, we beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her remarks and invite the proposition whip to complete the case for second today.
Madam Speaker, quite a lot of this debate has suffered from two serious problems. The first is that we have a comparison between the best examples of what religions can do and the worst, without a comparison of what is the probability of these happening, what generally happens in terms of what a religion does. The second is a conflation of what a religion does and what an organization uniquely does with that religion. And that's something I think we heard a lot from the member of opposition that stood up right now. I'll talk a lot more in rebuttal about why a lot of the stuff she said will still probably exist in a meaningful way in our world. I'm going to talk about two things in crystallization. Before that, I'll do rebuttal. The crystallization will be, first, what does religion look like in a world without these organizations, and why we think we capture a lot of the benefits we've heard from their side of the house. And second, the unique harms that come from organizations that we don't think either team in the opposition is properly engaged with. First, I want to deal with a little bit of rebuttal. We heard three broad ideas come out of the member speaker. First, that religion gives you a sense of hope. It makes it easier for you to recognize that you have support from other individuals in society. You have, for example, the ability of people who are impoverished to live on and feel as if they have a meaningful purpose in life. We think that this actually is problematic for a number of really serious reasons. The first is that it means that it's really, really slow for societies to change when there are serious problems that affect individuals and dehumanize them. For example, movements like the women's rights movement, the movement for like minority rights to exist, etc., are almost always the product not of religion saying you need to do this. Oftentimes religions for centuries, for example, go on and subjugate one group of people to the beliefs of the majority. It's usually a secular origin of these ideas that religions then have to adapt to and subscribe to when they realize that the mainstream ideas of society are going more in favor of egalitarianism, which means the majority of the positive benefits towards people who are disenfranchised come in our world, and in their world are more delayed due to more oppression over longer periods of time of people that actually need help the most. Moreover, we think exactly what they said, it makes people who are oppressed more likely to accept the Band-Aid solution that your religion loves you, God loves you, it's okay if you live in a really, really bad situation, because that's not the most important thing in your life. We think it makes people much more likely then to accept oppressive structures, not only on the state level, but also on the religious level, which actually leads to more mistreatment in the long term. Moreover, we believe that states oftentimes are contradicted by religions. When states are representative of individuals that want egalitarian change, or for example, a progressive movement in favor of rights to gay people, and religions as collective organizations that might have an anti-gay identity galvanize their members against the beliefs of mainstream population in order to maintain their power and maintain the belief that they are almost always universally correct, which means that there's never any meaningful change. And as both teams in government have told you, group identity will still exist in a meaningful way because it's a shared vision of what people care about. We heard that you're going to feel alone and not meaningfully able to connect to other people. As Andrew told you, there are many forms of social bonds that exist in terms of your family, in terms of your state, in terms of your community. We don't know why the religious view is so much better than all these other closer connections that it offers a meaningful increase in the amount of connection that exists. We finally heard that empathy and charity is better when you have an organization where you go, like IDEA tell you should go out and find people who need help, but that's precisely what religion does uniquely. It doesn't rely on an organizational structure. Religion say you should be good to your neighbor. Religions say you should help all individuals, that the meek shall inherit the earth, and that's important to recognize. That's not something that comes out of organizations uniquely, and we think it's something that applies to religions in general, which is what I'll touch on right now. Does Backcap have a point? Or do you no longer have a point? In which case I'll take front.
As I told you in my opening speech, the difference between the bonds of nationality versus religion is that individuals share the most intimate problems about death and suffering and guilt, and creates a brotherhood that lasts between time.
I understand. That's fair. We think that these things are going to be shared anyway, for the precise reasons of collectivization that Andrew identified. And I ask you when you're looking at this round to actually look at the arguments we heard come out of these two teams and see what was said about how organizations exclusively, by virtue of their organizational structure, lead people to collectively bond over these things. Because we think that a lot of what we heard was people of the same religion will do these things. But as both of us have said, people will still seek out religion and will still seek out social bonding, which are things that will exist in a very, very similar, probably about equal percentage in our world as in theirs. So let's crystallize a few more things in this round. First, what does a world without religion look like? It's Ops' burden in this round, we believe, to show why organizations are key to getting people to endorse more of these values and to bond more. Why is this the case? Because it's pretty clear that, even they say, people always have questions about what is the meaning of life? How do I answer these things about purpose? Those things will always exist, which means that if religions exist, which it's clear in both worlds they will, people will seek out those religions, and people will still find all the values of shared connection that they talk about on their side of the house. Moreover, we tell you that if there's no religious organization that exists, or even religions, they'll probably form socially cohesive, rational decisions about how do we interact with each other in a meaningful way. Andrew told you this is usually about what is proven via evidence-based results. Science, things that are verifiable and universal across people of different religions in different areas of societies. That's important because it means we have more interconnectedness throughout the entirety of the world in different regions and different sects of people, which means the majority of the things we heard about bonding and about meaningful agreement exist in our world just as much in a meaningful way as they exist in theirs. As a consequence, second, what unique bad things come out of religions? A number of really important ones. First, it's the galvanization of the us versus them mentality that exists not just between religions, i.e. Muslims versus Jews, but inside religions, i.e. Shiites versus Sunnis. Why is this the case? First, we tell you it's because it gives them power, and moreover, it makes it easier for them to convert people in the long term. When you create this fear that says that other people are out to get you, you need to join our group, our organization, for you to have support in the long term. This uniquely galvanizes them in wartime situations. That's why wars exist. It's because when people get complacent and stop following all the edicts of a religion, you create a threat and you make people follow that threat, and as a consequence you have people war against each other in the first place. Moreover, comparatively, we heard that there are like violent parts and good parts of religions. We'll tell you that religious organizations are more likely to make people do the violent parts, like stone other individuals, because it creates an us versus them fear mentality. If you're afraid of being stoned, you're more likely to convert to a religion that will stone you if you're not a member of it, which means that there's more likely to be violence among individuals. And moreover, we tell you that religions have shared values. Islam, Judaism, all these things often believe in the value of collectivization and the value of helping each other out. But when you have the us versus them structure of organizations, people overlook that, and people are more likely to combat with each other, and as a consequence have a lot more harm that otherwise wouldn't exist. We still think you have things like charity, because organizations, because like not religious organizations will still exist that say it's good to help other people. If everyone subscribes, for example, to the idea you should help your neighbor, you can have collective efforts that aren't like organizations, the Catholic Church, that tell you should go out and help other individuals. And in the long term, we have much more equal access to these things and these values in a way that's not as violent as what you see on their side of the house.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and invite the opposition whip to assume the floor and complete the term of debate here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Obviously, this debate, as we heard numerous times in the last speech, is about organizations, and I'm going to talk about that extensively in my speech. But before that, I want to make one thing clear. Even if proposition shows you that religion or the values that they still believe will exist could potentially exist, we would argue that, especially from closing opposition, we provided you a justification to believe that at the point where those principles and values that give meaning to people can be more easily formed and more easily accessed, even if they could potentially exist in Gov's world, the fact that they're easier to access on ours is another reason why I think that the opposition side of the bench carries the debate. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about broad social outcomes of religion, and I want to talk about the effect religion has on individuals. Let's talk about social outcomes. A big social outcome that proposition is scared about are communal tensions and war. And the justification you get from opening government is because you feel as if you have to act against other religions, these kinds of communal tensions and wars are more likely. We have three responses to this. First, it ignores many religions that do not proselytize and do not explicitly seek to spread doctrine by force to other people. Secondly, in many religions, faith and love for human beings is held to be extended to all, irregardless of their faith. The notion of agape in Christianity, or unconditional love for all people, is not contingent on your specific religion. Clearly within religion, no thank you, there are clear messages of love and toleration that extend to all. Proposition is concerned about people who look at religious doctrines and interpret it to be violent. But let's look at those individuals who they're concerned about. If they're the kind of people who look at a text that has in it the potential for love and hate, and they have a pre-existing bias towards hate, I would argue that they would pursue those options irregardless of the religious text, because they already have the preconceived no thank you notions and preconceived desires and interests in pursuing those violent agendas. That's why they can look at a religious text that is filled with messages of love and still pursue those hateful actions. That's why I think it is far more likely that the harms they talk about exist on their side of the house as well. And the idea that people will now defer to evidence-based studies instead of pursuing hateful actions ignores firstly like phrenology and lots of science that invalidate and justify like incredible religious hate, and I think doesn't understand that the kinds of motivations for hate and violence will exist without religion as well. We get a different justification, no thank you, to be fair, from second opposition, who says that, look, religious philosophies are broadly similar, but organizations play up differences within them to get more members. We think there's three problems with this. Firstly, let's apply Ilya's probability doctrine of what happens in the vast majority of cases. In the vast majority of cases, the oppositional things that religions play up don't lead to war, given that in the vast majority of cases, countries are able to have religions coexist in relative peace, and where they are not, the root conditions of that are not differences in religious doctrine, but underlying socioeconomic conditions, no thank you, that make that conflict more likely. But secondly, we reject on face's characterization of how religions go about trying to convert members. Trying to stone people who will not follow your faith is generally not an effective way to get them to convert. The idea is most effective proselytization, no thank you, is constructive in nature. Rather than trying to show you that your religion does not have faith, it tries to show you the unique aspects that are appealing about a particular religion in a constructive sense that is far more likely. But the third response to his idea of oppositional, the ways that religions convert people, is that they're okay with the religious principles in general. They say that religious philosophies are broadly similar. Our contention for second opposition is that even those aspects of religion that you believe to be positive are less likely to exist in the absence of organizations. No, thank you. That's something I'm going to get into in the second theme of this round. The last thing we hear about this debate then is this theme is that socially conservative policies are passed because it is not possible to question the word of God because you will go to hell. Again, it's interesting to note that lots of religions do not prescribe hell to people who do not follow particular pieces of doctrine, but more importantly, no thank you. I don't think they engage with stuff you get from both opening opposition and closing opposition about how religions can internally evolve and can move towards different interpretations, no thank you, of what it means to be a part of that faith. I don't think that actually understands, I'll take you in a second, the idea of socially conservative practices being inherent to religion. Go ahead.
The idea is not that it doesn't happen at all. The idea is that you have incentivized inertia in there. Religions will just act if it's getting a huge PR problem. And until then, they will probably still hate gay people.
No, I mean, I think that the fact that it'll take a degree of time is not a reason to say that religion inherently must lead to these kinds of problems. I think on your side of the house, religious doctrines do not exist. The kinds of incentives, as we've talked about, for particular people to have violence against these individuals still exists. I want to talk about the second theme in this debate, about the effect that this will have on individuals. Especially from second government, no thank you, we get the idea that, look, religious principles and the things about religion that are good can exist without organizations. Opening government tells you people can still read Bibles, presumably they have to write their own Bibles, I guess, because there's no centrally produced one. Nonetheless, I think it is important that there are three issues we need to deal with this. Firstly, they never show you on either government team why the average person has the mental ability or processes by which they can actually form a coherent and uniting perspective of how the world is ordered and moral faith, no thank you, without the absence of religion. Even if there are some people who can do so, I'd argue for the overwhelming majority of people who neither have the time nor energy to do these kinds of processes, no thank you, religion is tremendously helpful. But the point they never respond to is that as human beings, we aren't like islands. We would like to believe that others also subscribe to our beliefs, no thank you, for it to be valid. The idea that people can form individual conceptions of belief that actually have meaning to them ignores the fact that our ideas of what are valuable are often fundamentally linked, and no thank you, in what we think other people believe. And that source of community is how I think those good religious principles come to actually have meaning to people, no thank you, in a way that's important, no thank you. But lastly, on this point, Aisler shows you that the communal benefits that result from religion, no thank you, require organization. So even if religion could exist without organization, our argument is it is strengthened through the presence of organization. And this is where all the things Aisler tells you come into effect. The idea that people who live in gut-wrenching, inescapable poverty, when they have access to religions that tell them that there is a purpose to their suffering, that there is a better world waiting for them, are more likely to feel psychologically content. This is a benefit that no kind of social philosophy or basic secular philosophy can provide to these people. The response we get from the second government team is to say that it actually makes it less likely that people will fight oppression when they view that, then they think that there's some greater purpose or benefit to them waiting. The problems are, firstly, in many cases, and in the vast majority of cases, these people don't have realistic mechanisms to fight the oppression they're talking about, because even in the absence of overt oppression, they live in poverty and have been ignored by their societies and are still going to suffer. But secondly, even within religions, we can often see, in the example of the civil rights movement you've heard, that religious sin is viewed to be, oppression is viewed to be a religious sin as well. I don't think that precludes the idea of action being taken against these people. Ultimately, we think that the unique benefit we get in this round is the immense source of psychological solace and purpose that people get from religion. The harms we get from that side of the house are likely to exist on either side, but the benefits you get from Aislin's speech come when people have a meaningful conception of religion. We beg to oppose.